Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to come and talk to Warrington U3A photography group. So yes, this is clearly wildlife photography. My background at the University of Liverpool involves a lot of imaging, but mostly, of course, imaging for scientific reasons. I also have a passion for astronomy and astro imaging, but this talk is particularly about just looking at animals. Some friends and I have been on safari a few times, and what I'm going to be showing this afternoon are a number of different images from various safaris. So this isn't really a talk, it's an excuse for me to show my favorite wildlife photos. I'm not going to try and teach you to suck eggs, but basically along the way there might be a few hints and tips, maybe a few do's and don'ts, and just for those that prefer it, a little bit of technicalities on shutter speeds and apertures, etc., for those that like that sort of thing. The intention is not to teach you anything, the intention is just to perhaps indicate how you might get more out of your attempts at capturing wildlife, and it doesn't really matter whether you follow my example of going to Africa to take pictures of big cats or whether you prefer to take pictures in your back garden. So in order not to make it just a random collection of photos, I've tried to collect everything under some sort of heading. So I'm going to be talking about composition and focus and lighting, just a little bit about shutter speed and aperture, and about the context, photographing wildlife in context, and a little bit about serendipity, the sort of things you can't plan for. So firstly, let's think about composition and framing. So the first question might be, if you want to go on safari and go to Africa and take pictures of big cats or cheetahs or wildebeest or whatever your favorite animal is, do you need a really long telephoto lens? Is it this sort of thing that you actually need? You've got to admire the biceps on that chap, haven't you? Look at that. Do you really need a whopping great telephoto lens? Those people who go out to Africa specifically for birding tend to have relatively long focal lengths, mainly because you simply cannot guarantee that the bird you want to photograph is in the nearest tree. It could be in a tree 50 meters away, and sometimes you do need the pull of a fair old telephoto lens. But having been on safari for quite a few years now, I have hit upon the ideal lens for me. The ideal lens for me is a 300mm lens. I happen to be a Nikon user, so that is my lens of choice, 300mm f4 lens. It's very lightweight, which means if you do have it in a camera around your neck, you hardly notice it for hours at a time. But most of the time I'll be photographing from either a monopod or a tripod or some sort of a mount, usually bolted onto the side of the safari van that happen to be traveling in. But you can see from the scale there of the human hand, it is a relatively small and lightweight lens, only about 150mm long or so, and into that it packs a beautiful 300mm f4. And a lot of the images, not necessarily all, but the vast majority of the images I'm going to show you are taken at 300mm focal length. So can you get close enough? Is 300mm enough? Do you not need a 600mm and a ×2 converter and another ×2 converter just to be on the safe side? Well, here's a nice picture of a lion that happens to be doing nothing but snoozing, which is what most lions do, facing into the wind, so the wind brushes its mane backwards very nicely. And the question is, can you get close enough to get decent images? Well, the real way of showing you how close you can get is one of my friends took a picture of my left ear deliberately to show that this is the sort of distance to which you can get to predators. Predators aren't worried about having tourists around because they aren't preyed on by other animals. So they don't really care if you get to within 10 meters of them. So it's not that unusual to get to a distance that's comparable to the distance between me and, let's say, the back row of the audience here. And so you can see that a modest telephoto lens is more than enough to capture those sorts of animals. Prey animals are a little bit different. So if you're trying to get antelope, they are a little more skittish because they get eaten. So you have occasionally got to worry about the fact that you can't just go bowling up to them and make a noise. You've got to keep your distance, you've got to keep quiet, etc. So it does depend on whether you're talking about approaching herbivores or approaching carnivores. Coming back to the splash screen we saw a moment ago, let's just think about composition more generally. This was a lioness that on the Serengeti. This was actually in Tanzania rather than most of the safaris I've been on in Kenya. This was Tanzania. And the lioness here is not simply posing on this bough for us, this bough of the tree. This lioness is actually protecting her cubs who are in the long grass, and you can't see them. The cubs were coming through. The lioness decided that she would plonk herself on the bough of that tree in between us and her cubs, and made it very clear that she was in charge of this situation and she was going to stay there until the cubs were out of danger. She didn't see the tourists as a threat, but she wanted to be clear that she was protecting her cubs. And for just one instant, she looked over her left shoulder, and I took this picture. But I didn't have quite long enough to realize that wasn't really the framing I should have taken, because I had the lioness in the center of the field of view, in the center of the frame, which worked well when she had her head lined up on the log. But when she turned her head over the left-hand side, what I really should have done was reframe the shot slightly. But in this particular case, I sort of forgot that, because I was in the moment and I wanted to capture the image. And of course, that's the beauty of digital photography. As long as it's sharp, as long as it's well focused, as long as it's well exposed, afterwards you can always go back and crop it differently and you still get a nice picture, because of the beauty of having plenty of pixels in your image, plenty of megapixels to play with. So that is the splash screen as it ended up with, and it's a much more interesting image to have the lioness looking into the picture than having her perfectly centered. And when it comes to an image like that, this is a male lion. It happens to have broken its paw, and it's probably healed incorrectly, which is why it looks a bit odd. But this particular lion was approaching the water, so I thought I would get a picture of it as the male lion approached the water. And I picked the lion and the reflection in the water. But when you see the reflection in the water, you realize there's a little bonus there as well. There's a lioness in the same picture. So again, that wasn't actually the original framing I took. The original frame was trying to get everything in, including the lioness. And only afterwards did I realize, well, actually, that's okay as a picture, but is it actually more interesting as a picture to take the lioness out of the top, leave her as a little bonus to be seen only in reflection? So you can't always get the composition you want, because you don't always have time to think, is that the best composition, or should it be that, or should it be portrait rather than landscape? Sometimes you have to grab the image when you can. That's especially true with birds. They have a habit of flying away if you wait too long. And sometimes that's true with animals. Sometimes you only get the right framing, the right composition, when you get home and you look at it and think, I should have done that slightly differently. Again, I don't want to teach you how to take photographs, but I have found in the past some people have fallen foul of the fact that they don't necessarily fully understand the way their camera works, especially in the way it focuses. Some cameras allow you to focus at particular points, spot focus. Some cameras will take focus at lots of different points and then decide what's going on. So in this particular case, of course, the camera would tell you that all of those background regions are out of focus. And maybe your camera will decide, if you allow it to decide where's the best focus, maybe it will decide that this high contrast region up here is actually where it should be concentrating its focus. Some cameras will take focus at different points and make an implicit decision that obviously the closest object is the interesting one, because normally that's the case. Most of the time, the uninteresting bits of an image are stuff that's in the background. And it is often the case that the closest thing in the image is the interesting one. But in this case, clearly not. It just happens to be a bit of foliage. So you sometimes have to override your camera focusing system to get it right. For instance, this bird in a tree, it is very common to find, when you've got a bird in a tree, it is very common to find some bits of foliage are actually in between you and the bird. And it's very easy for the camera to suddenly decide that the front branch is more interesting than the bird further away. Remember, the camera, no matter how intelligent it claims it is, the camera is stupid and doesn't actually know what the object of interest is. Just because it happens to be bright orange doesn't mean that's necessarily the thing you wanted to photograph. So in some cases, you definitely have to override the decisions made by the camera if you're leaving it on auto exposure, autofocus, etc. In many cases, you don't have to worry about the actual focusing distance. In this case, the tree is so remote, and all of the cormorants in this case are all at essentially the same distance, and so the camera has no problem picking out the birds and focusing correctly. And fortuitously, in this particular case, the bird happens to be very conveniently sitting amongst a whole load of branches that are all in the same plane. And so if the camera did decide to focus on one of those leaves, it would effectively come to the correct focus anyway, as long as it ignores the background. When it comes to focusing on animals that are distinctly not in the distance, again, this is a close approach, perhaps a little bit closer than we should have been. In this case, it wasn't us trying to get close to the lion. We were actually static, the friends and I, in a safari bus. And the lion was curious, the lioness in this case was curious, and started approaching us. It is said that the rule is if an animal is so close that you can't necessarily focus on everything at the same time, if you have a choice, focus on the closest eye. Because it's a human thing, whenever you see a photograph of another person, it is normal for one person to talk to another by focusing on the closest eye, not the most distant eye. That's just a psychological thing. Here it makes virtually no difference, and I never have time to think about that. If it's so close, I have to decide what I'm going to focus on. I chicken out usually, and I usually focus on the whiskers, mainly because the whiskers are usually there on a lot of different animals, and the whiskers are usually white, and they're usually clear, and they are very distinct. So I don't necessarily focus on the eyes, I often focus on the whiskers. Some animals, of course, are moving, and so you have to worry about, am I going to continually refocus? Am I going to tell the camera to track focus so that as the animal moves, the autofocus system keeps moving with the animal? Or am I going to focus on a rock and wait until the animal reaches that particular position and then snap the shutter to get the animal in focus? In this particular case, we were very lucky to have, in fact, a number of different years, we were very lucky to have a very experienced driver guide who told us, well, that leopard, you can take a picture now if you wish, but it's still quite a long way away. If you just wait a moment, we are not going to drive towards the leopard. We're going to drive in the opposite direction and curl round and park just over there, because that leopard is on its way to a watering hole. And if we park over there, the leopard will walk straight past us and you'll get a beautiful shot. We thought, okay, the idea of driving away from an animal to photograph it seems a bit odd, but this guy seems to know what he's talking about. And damn right, a few seconds later, a minute or so later, the leopard walked effectively right past us. In this particular case, probably a distance comparable to where I am to the front row rather than from where I am to the back row. Literally just a few meters away, and again, as it walked past, focused on the whiskers as it moved past. Again, beautiful lighting in this particular case because this was close to sunrise. Again, something I didn't take into account, and maybe I would have changed it if I'd realized it at the time. I'm looking down on this cormorant with its beautiful reflection in the water and the tail just touching the water, producing these ripples there. And it didn't occur to me at the time that if I focused very carefully on the bird and the bird's eye, the reflection of the bird is actually slightly further away because we're looking down on it from above. And so if you get the head perfectly in focus, the reflection won't be perfectly in focus. It's close enough that it doesn't really matter. And if I'd realized that at the time, I might have focused on the rock, which is halfway between the distance to the bird and the distance to the reflection. But luckily that was close enough that it wasn't so much of a problem, so auto-focusing on the bird seemed to do quite a reasonable job. In this one, it's a bit tricky to work out what's going on. Which of this blue is water and which of this blue is sky? And you're trying to work out whether I put the image in upside down or not. They're both water, okay? So we're looking down on a region of water that happens to have a spit of land breaking the water up into two parts. And in this particular case, I was intending to get a picture of the mother and baby impala as they walked along. And I wasn't expecting them when they reached this little muddy region to decide they didn't want to get the hoofs wet, so they decided to jump over that region, and of course the fawn will always follow the mother in this case. So I wasn't quite ready for this, and I'm not sure if I was still focusing on the grass, waiting for the impala to reach that point. So in this particular case, unfortunately, neither mother nor foal are quite in focus, which is a bit of a shame because that would have made a nice picture if they were perfectly in focus. Let's have a think about lighting, using light to best effect. In Africa, we're basically in Kenya or Tanzania, we're pretty much on the equator. So we have sunshine most of the day. The sun rises at about 6 o'clock, the sun sets at about 6 o'clock. We're on the equator, so you always get 12 hours of daylight, and most of it is sunny. So you have light, you have good light, plenty of light throughout the day. But you must be aware of the fact that the direction at which the light hits the animal can make a huge difference to what the picture looks like at the end. A nice picture of a water buck, but the light is coming from above, and so it's not really delineating the water buck too well. The same for this little baby zebra, a beautiful animal, but look at the shadow. The shadow is directly underneath the animal. This is roughly speaking noon, which means the sun is overhead, not just at its height as it would be from the UK, but essentially overhead. And so the lighting is very flat. It is better, if possible, to go out on a game drive and take photos of animals in the early morning or the late afternoon, after sunrise or before sunset, when the sun is low in the sky, because you get a much more interesting effect. In this particular case, the sun is coming from the far right, and so you're getting the bright delineation of the animal's fur, and it tends to stand out better from the background. Similarly here, a wildebeest taken with the sun coming from the far top left, and again the sun is now lighting up the beard of the wildebeest that you wouldn't catch if you were simply illuminating it directly from above. So that is in your control, in the sense that you can go out at certain times of day and avoid the midday, stay in your lodge or your tent and do something else in the middle of the day, and do your animal photography at the end of the day, after sunrise or before sunset. And similarly, zebras, interesting in their own right, but if the sun is too far overhead, and it's almost overhead in this case, although it's a nice picture, it still tends to look a little bit flat, and is by no means one of my favorite zebra pictures. But I managed to catch zebra in their natural habitat shortly after sunrise. You get this beautiful light, you get this beautiful golden light, and the sunlight coming from the far top left is just catching the seed heads of the grass here and lighting them up, and you get this beautiful golden grass in the background of this particular scene. To me, that is quintessential Africa, not cheetahs chasing gazelles and killing them, not elephants running along the bush. That is quintessential Africa, because that's what animals do most of the time. They don't spend that much time running away from carnivores. They spend 90% of their time just grazing these various herbivores, and in this particular case, a little family group of zebras, most of which are eating, which is what they do, and one of which has got his head up looking out, just in case there's a lion somewhere on the horizon hiding behind a tree. So yes, they're always alert and always on the lookout, but most of their time, that's what they do. The herbivores graze most of the time, and only occasionally do they have to run away from lions and hyenas and leopards, etc. And again, if you can get it right, quite often as sunset is approaching, just before you have to end your photographic experience and get back to your lodge or your tent for the end of the day, there's always the opportunity, as the sun is getting really low in the sky, to catch those magic images with the sun glinting off the dust kicked up by the animals. In one case, it was a sunrise that caught our attention. My friends and I had packed up all our photographic gear, put it into the van, ready to go off on a journey to the next camp, the next lodge. And as I looked back over the watering hole outside this particular lodge, I realized the sun that was just rising over the lodge was actually hitting the eland. These are the largest antelope in Eastern Africa. The eland had come down to drink, and so the rising sun was just catching them and giving this beautiful reflection. So we asked our driver to hold, unpack, get our cameras out again, and then catch this photo before we moved on to the next venue. And again, this is one taken quite a long time ago. This is so old. This is film. Anybody remember film? Yes, before we went digital. A picture of a zebra, and I'm just trying to work out what it was thinking. It's clearly just standing in a sort of either a very shallow lake or just a puddle of water. It's barely a centimetre deep, and hence you get this beautiful effect of it sort of walking on water. But I just asked myself what was going through its mind. Was it just contemplating the universe? Was it looking for lions? Was it thinking of nothing in particular? It's just a very mellow, de-stressing sort of image to look at. Okay, let's have a little think about technicalities of shutter speed and lens aperture. Again, you want to try and choose the shutter speed and lens aperture that gets you the best image. Sometimes you do not have time to worry about such things. I admit that most of the time I have my camera on auto because if something suddenly happens, I want to be able to catch it without thinking about, have I got the right shutter speed, have I got the right aperture? But with Nikon, and I guess various other cameras as well, you can set it in a mode that it's basically on automatic, but right under your thumb, there's the option of overriding it, going a little bit faster or a little bit slower on the shutter speed, or opening up the lens or closing down the lens. So it only takes a fraction of a second if you have the presence of mind to think about, would this shot be better if I had a different shutter speed? This particular butterfly was buried deep in the undergrowth, so it is very dark in this particular case. And perhaps you can see that immediately behind the butterfly, it's out of focus. But luckily, the butterfly's wings were flat, and so broadside onto the camera. So it didn't matter too much if I had a very limited depth of field. So in this particular case, I had an aperture of f4, and even in the dark part of this bush, that still gave me a shutter speed of 1/400th, which is enough handheld to keep it very nice and sharp, and I could have got away perhaps with a bit more, and I could have increased the depth of field a bit more at the expense of sharpening up some of the background. And of course, we know that in some cases, keeping the background out of focus is a good way of making the subject stand out against the background. But occasionally, you just haven't got time to get it right. And again, when the light was really failing, it was essentially sunset. And as the safari van was heading back to the lodge, a couple of cheetahs came out of nowhere and started running alongside the van, as if they were just playing with us. They weren't chasing prey, they were just a couple of brothers who were just playing with each other and running alongside. And at that point, I just realized how fast cheetahs can be when they really want to. And in this particular case, I grabbed the camera, it was f4, and 1/40th of a second at the time I thought would be enough, but clearly it's blurred completely. You can see the amount of distance the cheetahs have covered in 1/40th of a second by how much the background has blurred. And clearly the individual muscles and bodies of the cheetahs have completely blurred from the amount of movement in only 1/40th of a second. So although it wasn't what I intended, I ended up with quite a nice image because it really does convey the motion of a really fast animal. And a fraction of a second later, they were veering back off into the bush, taking a left-hand turn. The tail goes up to counterbalance the fact that they're doing a fast turn, much as they would do if they were chasing gazelles. And so again, you get a streaking of the background because I was trying to follow the cheetah, but again, it still moved in that fraction of a second to the point where you really can't get any detail, but you get the impression. So in a sense, that's accidental. I had intended to get a sharper picture, but at the end of the day, it's still quite nice. If your subject stays still long enough, then you can relax a little bit and say, right, what is the best speed? What is the best aperture for this? And in this particular case, this is a blue-eared starling. You can see the sort of blue behind its eye there. We have a starling. Kenya have about 176 types of starling, all different colors, all beautifully iridescent. And in this particular case, with the telephoto lens, making sure it was fairly wide open through the background, completely out of focus. So a nice little bit of bokeh there in the background where, although there is a bush behind this particular bird, it's so out of focus it doesn't detract at all from the beautiful outline and the sharp iridescence of the feathers in this particular shot. We can't always guarantee that the bird is where we want it to be. In some cases, lodges have posts and feeders to try and encourage the birds along. This particular raptor, which is a goshawk, if I remember rightly, this particular raptor We noticed as we were driving along, and it was obviously just sitting there in a bush, it wasn't particularly perturbed by what we were doing, but we figured it would probably fly away fairly quickly, so we had to snap it. So it's a little bit confusing down the bottom, but again, the background is far enough out of focus by choosing f5.6 to make sure that the bird, or at least its head, stands out very clearly from the background bushes, the background trees. I've already showed you this one earlier. Again, this was deliberately chosen, in this case f5.6 again, just a little bit stopped down from the full aperture of f4, in order to throw that background as far out of focus as possible, so the mane, even though it's a little bit ragged at the edges, the mane still stands out from the out of focus background. It doesn't really matter too much what's going on in the foreground, with the grass being in focus as well, as long as the background stays nicely out of focus. And there are occasions where you really have to compromise. In this particular case, clearly we have some bee-eaters on a branch here, and because the branch is effectively going away from us, they are all at slightly different distances. So I figured that, yes, this is going to be a problem, and the only way of guaranteeing that all four are sharp is to shut the lens right down to make sure I had enough depth of field to cover all four birds. But notice I didn't shut the lens down. This is at f4. It's at f4 because I really, really, really wanted to keep the shutter speed as high as possible. It's not obvious, but this was taken from a boat. So in other words, the boat was rocking ever so slightly, and I knew there's no point in getting it in focus if the shutter speed is so long that I can't possibly hold it steady enough to capture all birds sharply. So in this particular case, I bumped the ISO up. I usually leave it fixed. I don't particularly like having auto ISO. I prefer to know what particular combination I'm working with. So I normally leave the ISO fairly low, but in this case, I bumped it up to 400 just to allow me at f4 to get a shutter speed that's high enough that even with the boat rocking from side to side, I could still capture the bee-eaters. So although I'm happy with these three, I'm not happy with this guy, A, because he's out of focus, and B, he's got his back to me. So he couldn't even be bothered to turn around to get them all nicely lined up. The same is true of other birds when they're in flight. You have to think, is it going to be a problem getting it in focus, or is it going to be a problem freezing its motion? Am I going to be able to pan well enough to follow the bird so that a particular shutter speed keeps it in focus? In this particular case, watching this vulture, this particular combination seemed to work. I think it might have been fairly close to the automatic settings of the camera. I might not have changed it too much, because 1/1000th of a second is plenty for hand-holding a 300mm lens, and f8, generally speaking, is good enough to keep a bird in focus, unless it's really flying towards you or away from you quite fast. And one of these beasties, one of these vultures, seemed to have a little bit of a scrap with its neighbors, and that gave us a wonderful photo opportunity, and again, in some cases, perhaps waiting for just the right moment when all three birds are roughly the same distance, such that if you focus on one, you've probably got all three in focus. In this particular case, f6.3 was enough to pretty much guarantee that all birds were in focus, unless one of the three was particularly close or particularly distant. And as they were scrapping for a minute or two, there was always the possibility of waiting for the right composition and the right position of the birds to get them all in focus, and a fast enough shutter speed to keep them all from blurring too much. But it gives a nice impression of the fact that vultures don't always agree with each other. We're not actually sure what they were fighting over. They didn't seem to be fighting over the right to mate with females. They didn't seem to be fighting over food. Maybe it's two adults and a youngster, and they want the youngster to leave. I don't know quite what the argument was here. But there was an awful lot of talons and beaks going on in that particular fight. With some birds in flight, it's a lot easier, because some birds just soar. So for instance, if you get out in the early morning, as the thermals are starting to build, if you position yourself next to a little bit of a hill where there's an updraft, you can almost guarantee that some raptors will start to build up their soaring and start to find these thermals, find the updrafts from hills. And so in this particular case, I knew there were a number of auger buzzards around, and I simply stood my ground and waited for them to come reasonably close to overhead. And because they are effectively just soaring, they're not going particularly fast, and so even a relatively modest speed, in this case I went down to F9 to try and get the depth of field so that even if I didn't quite have time to lock in focus, I was happy that that was fast enough to freeze the motion, and that was probably enough to give me the depth of field to get a nice sharp shot of the organ buzzard. And they basically went round for quite a while. Again, as the morning warms up, it might take half an hour for thermals to build up to the point where they then go off and find food. So they went round every few minutes. You had a chance of catching them nicely in terms of aperture and shutter speed. One thing to remember is that in wildlife photography, sometimes it's the animal that matters, and in many cases it's the context. In other words, you shouldn't ever forget that the animal is in its natural habitat. You're always in danger if you go on safari in Africa and zooming in on an animal, you end up with a shot that could have been taken in a zoo. If you're going to East Africa, you really want to try and embrace the fact that it's in its natural habitat. So again, this is going back to the days of film. This is quite an old one from about 20 years ago. And this is a situation where we saw some elephants walking in a line, and our driver guide said, we're not going to drive towards those elephants. We are going to drive over there, because if we park there and wait 3 minutes, those elephants are going to walk in front of Kilimanjaro, which they did, but unfortunately Kilimanjaro up there is a little bit hazy, so you can't really see it too well. Maybe you can just make out the ice caps on the top of Kilimanjaro, which is sticking up above the clouds there. But he was right. We did actually manage to compose the image the way we want. We got the elephants walking along almost silently. It's amazing how a few tons of elephant don't make any noise at all. And yes, we managed to get the background of Kilimanjaro. It's a shame it wasn't a slightly nicer day, just a little bit crisper would have been nice, a little less haze, but still a nice image. And in this particular shot, I've been told before, you should have zoomed in the elephant more. You should have cropped it much tighter. That was not the intention when I took this. This elephant came out of the bush slowly, swinging its trunk from side to side, picking up some soil and throwing it into the air, which is why there's all this dust around everywhere. You can see a little bit of dust coming out of its trunk there. The intention was to give the context. This is what bull elephants do. They walk through the bush, and this was intended to pick up that environment of this is the bush, this is the natural habitat of the elephant. This wasn't taken in a zoo, this was taken in East Africa. And occasionally, again, generally speaking, animals are not necessarily disturbed by tourists, but they're sometimes very curious. In some cases, a giraffe will just look your way and then walk in the opposite direction. In this particular case, there were about 20 giraffes, and as we drove along at some distance, so this is an extreme zoom, a crop into one of the pictures I took, they were quite some distance away, but it was clear that they were just watching us go along the horizon as if, well, I might have seen one of these vans before, but they're just watching us to see what we do. Every once in a while you see adult animals trying to teach their youngsters. That's something you run away from, but that's something you don't have to be worried about. Clearly the animals teach their young what it is they should be worried about. Every once in a while you bump into animals by accident because they happen to get close to you, but that, generally speaking, is not how you encounter most animals. You don't encounter most animals because they happen to fall within a few meters of you. And generally speaking, I don't agree with the idea of going to chase an animal, not trying to get close to that leopard or trying to get close to those lions. Personally, I would be much happier just parking somewhere and seeing what animals you can see. So you won't often catch something that's just trotting by a few meters away. If you ever see a jackal, it's much more likely to be like that. It's much more likely that you happen to see it in the distance amongst the long grass. And that is something to bear in mind if you ever choose to visit East Africa. The grass length changes during the year because at certain times of the year, 1 million wildebeest come in and eat the grass and then move on and then head back to Tanzania again in the great wildebeest migration. So the length of the grass quite definitely changes with the rains, which then changes with the amount of herbivores that come in and eat the grass. So sometimes all you catch of an animal is the ears above the grass. They don't want to show themselves in case they are predated on by something else. So sometimes you only catch the animal above the grass. So if the grass is particularly long, you can hide a surprising number of animals in the long grass. Now we can argue whether or not that giraffe is actually sitting down or standing up, but clearly the grass must be quite long. Even if the giraffe is sitting down, that grass is quite long. And you can imagine that out in that vista, that savanna might contain a huge number of animals, but you might not be able to see them if those animals are shorter than the grass and if they don't want to be seen. So that's just something to bear in mind. But at other times of year, you don't necessarily get grass that's a metre tall. At other times of the year, especially if the wildebeest have already been through, then the grass is just a few centimetres or so in size. I make no apology for showing this again, because it's one of my favourite images. And you can see the grass is just a few centimetres, and you basically can't hide anything in grass like that. So all the animals are still quite happily grazing, but you can't hide anything but a small rodent. Did you have a question? No, I generally don't use polarizing filters. There's no need if the lighting is right. The only reason I can ever see to use a polarizing filter is if you want to make the sky bluer, which there's no need in Africa because already it's quite blue, or if you have an annoying reflection that you want to kill off water or possibly glass. And there's no situation that I've found yet in which I want to kill a reflection that will require a polarizer. So I do not have a polarizing filter in my toolkit, except as a scientist if I'm trying to show somebody what polarized light actually is, but not for photography, no. So again, context. You could say, here's an interesting bird, isn't it pretty? It's a lily trotter. So you could say, well, I'm not going to take a picture of the lilies, I'm just going to take a picture of the lily trotter. I'm either going to get closer to it or I'm going to crop it down. And this beautiful jacana, the beautiful colours there, including the pale blue of the head, you could say that's a wonderful image. But the purpose of taking this was to remind you it's a lily trotter, so it lives on lilies and it lives in a huge lake full of lilies. And a picture like that, even though the bird is rather tiny, gives the story rather better than cropping and zooming in to just the animal itself. The next category is serendipity. No matter how much you plan, there are certain things that happen that you simply cannot plan for, and you just have to be ready for them and try and make the most of the situation. If you go to East Africa, you can go to tented camps or lodges, and a lot of them will have watering holes just outside. Some of them are positioned deliberately to overlook a watering hole. So if you wish, these are some of my friends that I go on safari with. If you wish, you can go to one of these lodges, and during the day, you can just sit at this table and watch the watering hole with your binoculars, with your camera, with your bird book open, and your animal book, identifying what it is that's coming. It looks like there's not much there at the moment, but during the day there is often a stream of animals coming in, all taking their turns, by the way. The giraffe come in and then go, and then the warthogs come in and then they go, and then the elephants come in and then they go. I don't know how they schedule these things, but they seem to know what they're doing. If you wish, you can just sit here all day with the binoculars and just watch the animals or photograph the animals. And if you wish, they can bring you coffee every once in a while or something more alcoholic if you prefer. And it is a very relaxing way of spending a day doing absolutely nothing but sitting there and letting the animals come to you. But most people would prefer to go on game drives where you get in a van and you go driving. We don't like, my friends and I don't like the idea of chasing animals. So if we know that there's a leopard somewhere over there by the river and we know there's a pride of lions somewhere over there, we will ask our driver quite often, okay, if you know that's where the lions and the leopards are, let's go in the opposite direction and see what we find, because we'd much rather go somewhere quiet and just see what animals we see, just serendipitously. So here we came across a bush with a raptor in it that seems to have had its head exploded. Anybody figure out what that is? Raptors, like owls, for instance, they can turn their heads in any direction. And if you happen to turn your head 180 degrees, then the feathers on the back of the neck stand up because they're not smoothed down. So if a bird is not looking at you, it can give a very sort of odd impression. And that was just something we saw, and it took us a few seconds to work out what we were looking at until it turned its head round, and then we realized what it is we were looking at. Every once in a while, although antelopes tend to spend their life on four legs, every once in a while they'll get on their hind legs in order to reach some of the higher foliage. And so every once in a while you find, in this case a gerenuk, one of the antelopes that seems to like the idea of moving around on two legs in order to catch the juiciest parts of the bush. In this particular case, I happened to notice one crowned crane standing on top of effectively a tree. In the distance, so I thought, okay, 300mm lens, I can just about catch that. So I'll take a picture of this crowned crane standing in the sunshine at close to sunset in this tree. I tend to keep both eyes open when I've got an eye to the viewfinder. So I had my right eye to the viewfinder, but my left eye told me that something else was flying behind the tree. So I was fixated on this one in the viewfinder, but I just held off taking the picture because my left eye told me something else was going on. And then I realized it was probably the mate of this particular crowned crane coming up from behind, and it was going to land next to it. So I just waited till the air brakes came out and it unfolded its wings, and just before it landed, I managed to catch that particular picture. It was totally lucky that its wing happened to just sort of wrap around the head of its mate, and rather than obscure it or have one behind the other. So the composition was just luck, apart from the fact that I tried to get the timing right by waiting until just the right moment. And that was only because I kept my other eye open, rather than just clicking on that animal as it was there and then moving off or turning away and missing the fact that the other crowned crane was on its way to the same landing site. Occasionally you come up against lions that are doing nothing in particular. They spend most of their time doing nothing in particular. They hunt at night, generally speaking, and during the day they just sleep and play. So every once in a while, if you come across a pride of lions, there is more than enough opportunity to photograph them asleep or photograph them playing. Every once in a while you find the younger members of the family as well, and this lioness is doing what most lionesses do, sleeping while the kids feed. In this particular case, a lion, I think it's a lioness, is simply just trying to stay in the shade and get out of the heat of the midday sun. I sometimes wonder what the fate of that fly is. I think it's heading from right to left, so whether or not it survived that encounter with the lion or not, I don't really know. But if you're lucky enough to find the youngsters, then they are incredibly cute. So here, a recent addition to the pride of lions. I'm not sure exactly how old this one was, probably not that many weeks old. And the same for cheetahs. Occasionally you come across a cheetah, even if the cheetah is in the process of trying to find some food. Sometimes you find other family members are not far behind, quite often kept in the bushes whilst the parents do the hunting, but in themselves they are incredibly cute animals. And serendipity applies all the time. We were driving off nowhere in particular at the edge of the Masai Mara, and my friend said to me, what's that in the tree? And I said, well, which tree are you looking at? There's a lot of trees here. In that tree, is that a kill? Is that an antelope leg? Has that been put there by a leopard because he's going to come back later and eat the rest of the antelope? Well, probably it's just an antelope leg, yeah. Why don't we just go and have a look just in case? Okay, let's get a bit closer. It's not an antelope. It's actually a lion that just happens to be asleep there because, again, it's slightly cooler in the tree. There's not much foliage there, but it's slightly cooler in the tree compared to trying to have a sleep down on the ground there. And again, you just have to be ready for this sort of situation. We approached a lake. We thought there was going to be lots of flamingos there because there are usually lots of flamingos. Turns out these flamingos were in another lake on this particular day, but we arrived to find thousands of pelicans, and they just happened to decide to take off whilst we weren't too far away. So as we approached the lake, we were excited to see basically 1,000 pelicans just wheeling overhead before deciding to go flying off somewhere else. So these look almost like seagulls, and they almost look like the same size as seagulls. But remember, pelicans are huge birds with wingspans of many meters. And the sight of seeing 1,000 pelicans or so silently wheeling just overhead was quite incredible, and something we simply did not expect, because we were thinking that we'd probably catch a whole load of flamingos standing in the water, not a whole load of pelicans flying overhead. In this particular situation, we expected to find drought. We expected to find a whole dusty plain in this particular environment. We've been to this location before. It's called Amboseli National Park, where you often get a lot of elephants. And this particular vista, last time we were there, was just a dusty plain. But on this particular time we arrived, we were told, this water has just appeared. Not as the result of rainfall. It hadn't been a particularly rainy season, but the water in some parts of East Africa behave in rather odd ways. It's not simply it rains and it floods and you get a lot of water on the ground, but there's a lot of ice on the top of Kilimanjaro, and when that melts, it flows down Kilimanjaro and it flows underground. And then every once in a while it bubbles back up to the surface. So this rather shallow lake, you can see how deep it is from the zebra legs there, just appeared because water bubbled up from below. Maybe there were geological reasons why the water appeared at that particular time. But basically, in a matter of a week or two, this water just appeared and then stayed there for many, many months. So these zebra, we assume, sorry about the pun for this particular zebra crossing, these zebra apparently regularly walk across this particular plain. And you notice their tracks. You can see either from above or even from the ground, you can see the tracks where animals prefer to walk from one place to another. And these zebras prefer to walk from somewhere over on the right to somewhere over on the left. And the fact that it's now full of water did not make them think, okay guys, let's go round this water. They just continued to walk the same way they always walk. The fact that they were then knee-deep in water made no difference to them. And obviously the flamingos didn't seem to mind in the background there. But it was quite an amazing sight and quite an amazing sound to hear 100 or 200 zebras sloshing their way across the lake to get from one point to another. And it was completely unexpected because we had no idea that that lake was actually there. There's always encounters, especially if you just wait. Don't rush to find an animal, just sit and wait and watch and see what happens. So there's plenty of encounters with elephants, and in this particular case I just got the impression that this youngster was pestering its mother who was trying to eat, and the youngster was saying, "Mum, mum, 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 mum," or something, and the parent was just trying to get on with lunch or something, and I just thought this was a nice little mother and baby sort of cameo. And yes, there's no problem getting close, as long as you're careful, as long as you're quiet, as long as you don't wear really strong aftershave and spook all the animals. You can get close enough that a 300mm lens is easily good enough to get you the sort of portrait that you want. Some birds are in very distant trees, but every once in a while you get a convenient bird at a somewhat closer distance, in this case a fish eagle in a tree, at a distance that a 300mm lens gave a reasonably nice portrait. And again, compared to the grain that you would get if you used film and tried to blow it up, with digital photography you can usually get away with blowing up a crop of that image and still get a very nice image without worrying about grain coming through if you're using digital photography. As long as it's well exposed, as long as it's in focus, you can blow it up a considerable amount and crop it down to make a somewhat different picture. Getting close to cheetahs is not a problem because cheetahs don't see you as a threat. They're only worried about whether they can catch the next antelope in terms of where their next meal is coming from. They don't see tourists as a threat. Same with this lioness. This is the same lioness as the one on the log on the splash screen. In this particular case, she's emerging from the grass and giving us a damn good stare because remember, her cubs are out there somewhere in the grass. So she's not worried for us being a threat, but being a mother, she wants to make sure that she's protecting her young. And again, we had no idea that lion was there until it emerged from the grass and then suddenly realized what was actually happening. Sometimes we're told if you are going to have a night in a tent, don't go outside your tent at night. And I thought, why? It can't be that dangerous to leave the tent at night. And then the next morning, I saw a print outside my tent. The tents are here, and the print was on this path leading outside the tent. So as far as I can tell, lions do visit tented camps at night. So when they say don't leave your tent at night, they really do mean it. Either that, or they've got a wooden carving of a lion's paw and they put it into the mud just to keep the tourists happy. So I do sort of believe them that that's the thing we do have to watch out for. It looks like there's a lot of trees here, but actually there are regions where there aren't too many trees, and I would have loved to have gone out at night and taken pictures of the night sky. But on this particular occasion, I decided not to do any astrophotography because I took realistically their comments about no, lions do visit this camp regularly at night, so I had no intention of wrestling with a lioness whilst trying to take pictures of the night sky. Yawning yet? I haven't seen any yawns from the audience, but you know, we're getting towards the hour, so it's getting to the point where you must feel like, yeah, okay, heads are starting to droop, and yeah, it's always nice to catch the occasional yawn. That was just lucky that I happened to get right in line with this leopard so that when it yawned, I actually got a picture of its tonsils. That's not something you can usually go for. That's just, again, lucky that it happened to be in the right place when it happened to yawn. Some animals have difficulty yawning. This particular lion seems to have a scar on its cheek, and you're thinking, has it only got one tooth? Has it really been in a fight? And then you realize, oh, no, it has got two teeth. It just yawns lopsidedly because of the scar on its cheek. It's probably been in a fight at some point, and so it can't yawn very effectively. But no, it has got a full set of gnashes in there. And finally, remember that if you're going to do wildlife photography, especially if you're going somewhere other than just your back garden, if you're going somewhere nice, don't forget the views. Sometimes you have spectacular views of the landscape, the scenery, etc. In this particular case, a storm was brewing over the Masai Mara, and so we got this wonderful juxtaposition of dark clouds and the sun crepuscular rays coming through at the bottom. Sometimes you just have to admire that there's nothing here other than it was a sunrise, and the rising sun again was just catching the seed heads of the various grasses in this particular view. I was half hoping that an animal would suddenly show itself, but even without that, it's still just a reminder of how lush different parts of Africa can be. And every once in a while, Kilimanjaro does show itself a little more clearly. But of course, in this particular case, no elephants in the foreground. Okay, you can't have everything. That's a good excuse to go back again to try and get a shot like that with elephants rather than just a few birds. I was about to say small birds, but bear in mind that Cory bustard there stands at least 1 meter tall, maybe 1.5 meters tall. So it's actually quite a big bird, but unfortunately in this case, no elephants in the foreground. The picture was taken from Kenya. The mountain is in Tanzania, so the mountain is in a different country to the photographer in this particular case. You can perhaps see the landscape getting higher and higher and higher as we go further and further, and then as you go through the cloud, up pops Kilimanjaro with the ice caps right at the top there. There's always a sunset to be had, occasionally sunrises as well, but there's always nice sunsets to be had. And a sunset is probably the end of the wildlife photography, but it's not necessarily the end of the photography because, again, my friends and I are all interested in astrophotography. So for us, a sunset means the end of photographing animals, but possibly the start of photographing the night sky. Not from out in the bush, somewhere from the safety of the compound of a lodge or a tented camp, ideally one that has an electric fence, so you don't have to worry about lions or baboons visiting whilst you're trying to take your pictures. But a sunset is not necessarily the end of the day. Let me finish with the fact that it doesn't always work. Yes, I've shown you some pictures, and of course I'm not going to show you the terrible pictures that I took, but every once in a while it doesn't work. So weaver birds start by weaving a ring which eventually becomes a full cocoon of a nest. Weaver birds are quite small, And unlike an eagle, which will take a while to unfold its wings and then flap away, a weaver bird can take about a tenth of a second from a standing start to outside your frame. So in this particular case, I wanted to catch the weaver bird that was sitting here. And I missed it because it takes me a tenth of a second to fire the shutter button, and I wasn't quite fast enough in this particular case. And that happens quite a few times. So I have a quite extensive collection of branch photographs, if anybody is interested, where birds used to be. And I can tell you about the story of the birds, but you won't see them in the pictures. They're just lots and lots of pictures of branches. It happens. That's the wonderful thing about digital photography. You're not too fussed if you take a picture and it doesn't work. With film, you've wasted an exposure on your film. With digital photography, who cares if you missed it? You try again a little bit later. And the same is true occasionally with animals. In this particular case, a mother and foal were walking towards me. I thought, what a beautiful shot of a mother and foal. Grabbed my camera. By the time I got it to bear, they had decided they weren't interested in us after all. They turned round and started to walk in the opposite direction. So I was a second or so too late. And again, I have a large collection of bums, if anybody is interested, of animals walking away from us because I was just too slow to catch them. Sometimes I'm too slow and sometimes the shutter speed is too slow. This, I think, is a bird. Could be a handkerchief, but I think it's a bird, and I think these lobes here are the wings flapping. So the shutter speed was too slow, so I haven't caught the bird, and I think I didn't intend to catch that anyway. I think I intended to catch it whilst it was still sitting on a branch, and I was just too slow, and it had already launched itself and was flapping its wings by the time I took the picture. So no, it doesn't always work, but the beauty of digital photography is if a few, or even if a lot of your images don't come out, it doesn't really matter, because these days you can get SD cards that can hold I don't know how many thousand images, so it doesn't really matter. So, and finally, don't forget that I've been talking about a few guides. They're not rules, they're just things to think about. Composition, focus, lighting, the shutter speed, lens aperture combination, the context of what else is going on in the picture, and of course occasionally just making the best use of good luck. But the point I want to make is that that applies, yes, to going on safari in East Africa and taking pictures of big cats, but it also applies that if you're in your back garden. This is a picture I took of our family cat. This is taken in black and white, not because it's artistic, but because it was taken when I was a teenager and I couldn't afford color photography, so this is my attempt at black and white photography. I was a teenager, so I think this is about 47 years old, this picture, but the same rules apply. You try and frame it right. You try and get the light from the side rather than from above. You focus on the whiskers to try and get the subject as crisp and as clear as possible. In this case, it wasn't a problem of trying to approach closely. For those that know cats, you realize that when they start pawing the air, they are about to come and walk towards you for a stroke. So in this case, it was trying to keep the animal at a distance, not trying to get close enough to the animal. But all the guidelines I've shown, all the guidelines I've been through this afternoon, apply whether you're talking about a small cat in your back garden or whether you're talking about a big cat in East Africa. Thank you for listening.